Welcome to Season 3 of The Lifestyle Chase, and I'm your host, Chris Little. This podcast features high performers who have found a way to live their best life while balancing their health, wellness, friends, and family. To help this podcast grow, please share it on social media, rate 5 stars, tell your friends, and check out the past 140 episodes and counting. You can follow me on Instagram at Christian Little and at The Lifestyle Chase. Thanks for listening. Let's get started. All right, so welcome to The Lifestyle Chase. I am joined by the one and only Alex McBrairty. He was last on the show on episode 77. Today is episode 165. It is the very first episode where we are bringing you live Lifestyle Chase. It's live streamed on Instagram Live. Hopefully you're joining us. If you're not, stay tuned for future episodes. I can't guarantee every one of them will be live, but it is fun to play around. I'm open to feedback on what platforms you might want to have this on. But now that I've finished my rambling, Alex, how are you doing today?
I am doing pretty fantastic. It's a sunny day here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It's starting to warm up a little bit. So we're coming out of hibernation.
So it's been like probably over a year since you were last on the show. Lots of different things have happened, but just to kind of reintroduce my guests to who you are, like if you were describing yourself in the way that you want to describe yourself the most, like so many people have to have like their intro, and it's like, well, I didn't really want to introduce myself that way. So if you had the choice, how would you introduce yourself?
That is a loaded question. Ooh, that's where the deep pondering is coming in now. But let's think about this for a second. So how would I want to be described? Well, first and foremost, I am an online fitness coach, and I am passionate, emphasis on the word passionate, of helping people not only transform the way they live their life, both in fitness and nutrition and all the typical online fitness coaching things, but kind of even more than that on a fundamental mindset level of bringing my background in psychology into my coaching to help people develop new perspectives and beliefs about themselves and kind of their place in this world. And I do that by kind of the types of conversations and things we think about with my clients, but also just in kind of trying to lead by example of taking my own weight loss journey of the 80 plus pounds I lost back in high school and in my kind of own fitness transformation, and taking that into the things that I do in my own life personally, whether it be adventures or professionally or personally or whatever, kind of developmentally, so that I can walk the walk and help my clients do the same.
Well, I mean, that was a solid intro. Like the things that I reflect on when I think about you are your like psychology background, like the way that you're able to really dive down the rabbit hole with your connections with people and how you're able to level with people and like ask questions that might get different outcomes. But with that being said, in regards to like the year 2020, do you have any lessons that stood out to you that you wouldn't have anticipated? Like we are right now at like the anniversary for a lot of regions for like 1 year since most gyms got like locked down, since there was restrictions in place and people's lives and businesses changed. Like what stands out to you in your reflection of the year 2020?
For me personally, I think it would be the necessity of pursuing a purpose for ourselves. And here's what I mean by that, because that's a little ambiguous, is I was kind of very fortunate when all of the lockdowns happened almost a year ago today, at least here, where there was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of what's the future going to look like. People who were sent home from work were kind of like, what do I do now? People who had to close their businesses. Me at the time, not being able to train people in person anymore. Like, what are we going to do with just our day to day? And I think throughout the pandemic, a lot of the people who suffered heavily kind of suffered because there was nothing, right? It's like we're just sit and wait. We can't really do anything. We don't have any control over the situation. So it can be very kind of anxiety provoking to try to go through that and not know what's going to happen. And I feel very, very fortunate of my position in that, because my purpose as a coach didn't change when COVID hit and didn't change when the lockdowns happened. How I did it may have changed a little bit, with obviously a more heavier emphasis on online stuff. But if anything, it made me more passionate and more driven in the purpose to help people take control of their health, especially in a time like now where, one, health has become first and foremost on everyone's mind, right? Because obviously health and viruses go hand in hand together. And so for me, like the reason I consider myself so fortunate is because I had that purpose. I think it avoided me getting lost in the year 2020. Like, I never considered myself having gotten lost. I always knew where I wanted to go. I knew I was going to be helping people as best as I could. However, that took shape over the year of 2020. But I woke up every morning and I knew that I had tasks to do. And I think that not everyone had that opportunity, because a lot of people let their health prevent them from seeing what the purpose is they want for themselves and for their life. I think a lot of people end up falling into the trap of going through the motions. And when it's normal life, it's easy to distract ourselves from that fact, right? We can fill it with social activities or nights out at the bar or things that basically allow us to just feel a little bit better in the moment, even though we don't really feel like we're going anywhere. And then COVID took all of those distractions away. And now we just had to sit with, like, what are we doing with ourselves? You know?
Yeah, well, like, I mean, that I can relate to that whole thing, and just like how when you spend time alone with your thoughts, like whether it be just like the shift in work atmosphere or the shift in like things to do, it makes you realize like areas that are like non-negotiable. It makes you really dial into your goals. Would you consider yourself someone that's fairly goal oriented, or is it just like the process, like sticking to the process and like sticking to the routine that gets you, that facilitates your goals? Like, when I say stuff like that, like what goes through your mind?
So I would probably say I'm a little bit of both. Like, I think it's important for me to know, to have goals in the sense of where am I going, right? To kind of orient myself. And I equate it to, like, if I were lost in the woods and there was a mountain range to the east, that would be helpful for me to know where I'm going, right? Because then I know what direction I'm traveling. But I would be remiss not to put a lot of heavy emphasis in the process itself, right? Because at the end of the day, I have an idea of where I want to go. And I like to say that I'm equally blessed and plagued by ambition and kind of the level that I would like to get to. And in so doing, I, to this point, have no idea how I'm going to get to the end goal, right? I have an idea, but that changes, and that's changed in the past too, however long I've been doing this. I mean, obviously, my day-to-day tasks, my business, my program, everything about my coaching now is starkly different than where it was when I first started. So the process is important for just keeping that forward momentum, and the long-term goals help me orient to make sure that the things I'm doing on a daily basis aren't just senseless. If that makes sense.
Yeah, well, when you talk about doing things day to day and it being senseless, like, what stands out to you as a moment when you've kind of fallen into that trap? Like, have you had a time when you're like, holy crap, I'm just basically like, my own passion project isn't the passion project that it was meant to be. I've kind of fallen complacent to my own journey. Like, tell me more about that.
So I have a really good example of this. For a period of about a year, every month developed a magazine for my email subscribers, a digital magazine. And it started before that. For the 2 years prior to that, it was a weekly email series that had like book reviews and playlists of songs I was listening to, and then like different thoughts that I would put in there about, again, mindset related stuff. And there were all these different categories, And I would do that email put it out every Sunday. I call it the Sunday Scoop. For 2 years, I did that. And then as time went on, I was like, okay, this is like, it was a lot of work. It was multiple hours on the weekends to do that. And I was like, okay, is there a way that I could enhance the experience of this and save myself a little time? So I was like, I got it. I'll turn it into a digital magazine where there's more full-length articles, some similar topics of stuff from that email series, but full-length. They ended up being about 20-page magazines, but I would just do it once a month. So I'll have 4 weeks to chip away at it gradually. It'll reduce the workload, and then I'll have this beautiful kind of experience that people can go into every month. And it was awesome. But I learned about myself that I would not chip away at it over the course of 4 weeks. I would save it for the last weekend of the month. And I would spend double the amount of time I would have spent on emails doing the magazine. And most of it was trying to find the right graphics, because a magazine is a very visually appealing piece. And so after a year of even more time spent on this thing, and I put a survey out to people on my email list of, whether they were reading it and enjoying it. And what I've learned is most people would just skim it. They wouldn't actually take the time to go through the whole thing, which is totally understandable. And so I realized that project became less about the content I was trying to send people and more about the design. I spent more time designing the layout and the graphics than I did the actual content itself. And that was a moment where I had to realize, okay, this totally defeats the purpose of doing it. Right?
Yeah, I mean, like, people can come across that in so many different aspects. Like, I think about, I am always trying to make improvements to the podcast based on people's feedback, because I'm like, look, like, I can put in all the effort that I want, but people are only going to come to a podcast if it's good. And if I have to take their feedback in order to make it a good one, then that's what I have to do. Aside from, like, people saying that they're, like, skimming through, like, your magazine, what was maybe the toughest feedback that you received? Like, some of the stuff that it's like you really had to sit on for a bit.
I think for me, it's interesting because I didn't really get any negative feedback about that project, which is usually the case, I think, most of the time. I think people are more likely to just not give you any feedback than to give you bad feedback, right? Especially if they like you. So for me, it was the fact that I was putting so much time into it and it wasn't being consumed in the way that I had hoped. Right? Which not every project we start is going to be a winner, right? Sometimes we got to take the L and move on. And so that was obviously something that, like, okay, this past year, how many Sundays did I give up trying to build this thing? And at the time I had a terribly slow computer where it took me multiple minutes just to put a single picture in. Now I had to sit there and wait and put it in and wait. Fortunately, I have a much faster computer now. But so kind of the time spent I could have deemed as being wasted over the course of a year on this thing. And just trying to reframe it as a learning opportunity, right? As a way to connect with people, obviously the thing that's important to me is the content. My thing with my coaching in general is giving people new perspective and new ways of thinking about themselves and about their world. And so what I do now, which is much more manageable and much more digestible for people, is I do an email called the Mindset Monday, which it comes out every Monday morning, and it's 100 words or less of something that I think is going to pack the biggest punch to start their week and give them really something deep to think about. And that, to me, it takes me 2 seconds to do one of those, especially if it's not. The biggest part is just making sure I keep it to 100 words, right? And make sure it's an impactful 100 words. But the open rates for that email alone are way greater than any of the other iterations of that project ever were, right? So, and that's kind of one of the things that I just internalize both in my journey, and I try to say it to my clients too, is the losses are ultimately what allow us to get better, right? I forget where I heard it from, but you never learn anything when you're right. You just confirm what you already knew.
Yeah, I mean, I actually recently heard that somewhere too, and I'm trying to remember if it was a podcast or maybe we were just like watching the same posts or something like that. But it's just, you need to fail and you need to not get things. Like, things need to not come your way. Things need to not work out. I think actually what it was, like, my example is the football league that Dwayne the Rock Johnson owns,
Mhm.
just started talking about acquiring the CFL. And The Rock had a short stint playing for the Calgary CFL team, and then he got cut. And so it didn't work out with the NFL. It didn't work out with the CFL. But like in taking these losses and not having a win, he actually like became one of the most successful actors in Hollywood. And then
Mhm.
he in turn is able to come around and be like, hey, like I actually made a lot of progress in my life, and this really worked out. So things like that are pretty cool. And it's just everybody, when they're struggling and they're coming across roadblocks, needs to remember like oftentimes the roadblock is the ticket to that next step. It's the ability to be able to be successful and get a win out of like an otherwise like non-advantageous situation. But one thing that I have to say is that you have written in a lot of publications. Like you've done a lot of different articles, you've gotten really good at it and just like getting yourself out there. And we've talked about this at length off the podcast, so that's kind of why I have that information. But give us sort of like an idea of how many different publications that you have been published in or written for.
Oh wow. Um, Off the top of my head, I could lay it. It's laid out on my website, and I'm thinking of the grid pattern it's in. So four across, I don't 13, 14 different ones, I think. Some of those articles that I've written full length for, some of them I've been cited in as a source for contributing to or whatever. And writing has always been kind of something near and dear to me. I think that's how one of my best forms of communication is my ability to convey through written word. And interestingly, the Mindset Monday emails is something I also adopted to help me kind of practice my writing on a different level because it's very easy for me to write a lot. And so I'm working on short. What's the biggest impact for the least amount of words?
That's something
Uh,
I also struggle with. That it's very easy for me to write a lot. It's very easy for me to talk a lot. And just learning how to say the right things or write the right things at the right time and say them in ways that are the most valuable and the most captivating. With all of that being said, what have been the things that have kind of helped you to refine your skills?
Doing it a lot. It's I think the other thing too is I tend to just be as you well know, a very dramatic person in general. And I will say the one caveat of writing is it doesn't really allow me the same impact of a good dramatic pause. But um, I think because I'm very dramatic, it's easy for me to, as I'm thinking about things, uh, putting that into my writing so that it has a little bit more of an emotional impact and how I do things. I also I can always get better at this, but I like to use very colorful kind of analogies. Um, One of my recent Facebook posts that I think you saw the other day was about comfort zone and it being kind of the opposite of pleasure, and there was kind of some very colorful prison analogy going on in there, of being held captive and stuff like that. Um, but ultimately, just doing it so that you kind of learn what's good, what works, what doesn't, what sounds good. And even now, I'll go back to old articles on my website because I have over 100 different articles on my website, and I go back to some of the older ones, and I'm like, oh, what was I doing? Right. So practice, practice.
So, for I might have some new trainers listening to this episode. Somebody brand new to the industry just got certified. They've never written for anything, or it could be even an experienced person that just hasn't thought about getting their work published. They might have done it on their own website, but they haven't put it anywhere else. Can you kind of give them some words of wisdom for how they might get their start, how they might get their name out there, or how they might just like put out their first effort?
Yeah. So I guess two things in particular. One is more of a, I guess they're both technically strategies. One's a little bit more generalized, one more specific and targeted. So the specific and targeted one is what I did to get my start was in getting published in or being cited in other works was there's a service called Help a Reporter Out. I don't know if you guys have it up in Canada, but or if it extends into Canada, but in the U.S. we have this service called HARO, Help a Reporter Out. And basically anyone who's writing an article for a publication of varying sizes, it could be a small publication, it could be a nationwide one, and they need expert sources for their articles on a particular topic, will go to the service and put their topic in, whatever. And then when you sign up to be a reference for this site, you can choose the category if you want lifestyle and fitness only, or if you want technology or business or whatever. So this is true whether you're a fitness professional or just any other industries too. It will send you an email 3 times a day with a list of article ideas or topics. And then, so that's how I got started. As I signed up for this, I found ones that were relevant to things that I could confidently talk about and actually provide some good insight in. And then you email essentially the author directly, and you tell them, or you basically write up a little email of who you are and how you can help and stuff like that. And then they'll choose whoever they want. And then they'll use you, right? Or they won't.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is they don't always tell you if they use you. So that's why the other day we were talking, and occasionally I'll Google myself just to see, because I remember one of the first ones I got in was a USA Today article, which is a pretty big nationwide publication here. And I sent it in. I didn't hear anything back, which is pretty customary. If they're not going to use you, not everyone's going to take the time to tell you they're not going to use you, especially if you get a lot of entries. But I was just randomly Googling myself a couple of days later, and there my name was in USA Today, and I was like, right. And then from that, because in each publication you get in, then you can use that as a stepping stone to get into other publications. You can say then in your next email to your next pitch, hey, I'm so-and-so, this is what I do. I've been cited in this publication. I'd love to help you out with yours. Here's the answer to your question or whatever, right? And then that gives you more credibility, which then leads to more publications and more publications. So that's why I have so many, is because each one I did, I was able to in turn use to get into more, right? Because it's just that social proof. If one of these authors sees that you've been cited in other big works, some of them bigger than the one they're writing for, they're more likely to use you than somebody who doesn't.
Right? Well, that's pretty understandable. I mean, it's just like anything. It's like easier to understand like the product that you're going to receive with somebody that happens to have like done the thing already, similar to how like in a job application they're going to look for like an experienced candidate, somebody with a couple of years, somebody with some experience under their belt. With all the articles that you've done to this day, which one stands out to you the most and why?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I got a couple of favorites. I think probably one of my favorite articles to date is an article called Quit Overeating by Defining Your Happiness. And I wrote it in breakingmuscle.com. And that one was just, it's still, I think, one of the most relevant articles I've ever wrote. It's timeless in that sense that you could read it. I wrote it 4 years ago, but it's as relevant now as it was back then. And it talks about how people tend to, particularly people who struggle with their eating and their health, tend to fall into the trap of using food to create their source of happiness and their source of pleasure, right? And we, though, basically our achievements, the things we accomplish in life, the things that are difficult, right? Graduating, having a business be successful, getting a certification, any of the big achievements that we have, right? Getting a promotion, all require a lot of work. It's an achievement followed by long periods of hard, challenging work, and then another achievement, usually a higher, better achievement, right? And so we get this immense sense of satisfaction and pleasure when we accomplish one of those big goals. And then we're kind of on top of the world for a little while. And then it's temporary and it goes away because now it just gets normal, right? So then we have to start the process over again. We got to do the challenging, hard, difficult work until we get to another accomplishment. That pleasure that we get from achieving a big accomplishment is chemically the same pleasure we get from eating something highly palatable, a really delicious, tempting treat that we love. The difference between the two, right, is food doesn't need long periods of tough, challenging work to get it again. We can get it like that, and boom, we got the pleasure again. We're back at it, right? And so it's easy for people to fall into the trap of just doing that over and over and over again, right? Especially like we were talking about earlier, if they're not really set on a purpose that they have for themselves, something big that they actually are passionate about working towards, whether it's professionally, personally, whatever, that then gives them reason to go through the challenging, tough, hard work to get to those big accomplishments. Both of those sense of accomplishment, achievement, or food are both temporary. Food pleasure goes away when you're done eating it. The accomplishment pleasure goes away eventually, days, weeks later, however long it takes for it to become normalized, right? Even though they're both temporary, the food pleasure, like we said, once it's gone, it doesn't come back until you do it again. The achievement pleasure, even though it goes away, we still can get a hit of positive emotion and pleasure when we think about it again. It's a form of nostalgia, right? So a good example for me is, in 2018, I went to Spain to run with the bulls. And that was like a hugely crazy adventure for me. It gave me a lot of pleasure in the moment. But even now, when I recollect those memories that I have, it still gives me pleasure. I still feel good about it. I like sharing that story with people, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you about that cookie I had yesterday because it makes me feel so great about myself, right? So that article basically, in a long-winded way of saying that, hence why I'm practicing on shortening my writing, is we can go for either form of pleasure. One is ultimately going to serve us better in the long run, right? And we can't have those big achievements without the hard work in between. But if we can define what that is, what we're driven towards, then the temptation of getting our pleasure solely from food ceases to exist as strongly.
That was deep. Like that, my mind is blown. I mean, it's some good reflection for anybody. I mean, we'd be lying if we said that we don't like cookies or if we don't have like food that, like you have something you haven't had in a while and it brings you good memories and stuff. But truly, like, the things that are worth accomplishing do take grueling effort, and they take some being able to put up with what might be difficult, like having to have the capacity to just keep going and keep pressing forward. Did you have any challenging times in the last 12 months where you kind of thought that you were ready to just like stop, or when you needed somebody else's assistance, or did it go pretty smoothly for you? Like, what was it like for you?
It's interesting as a small business owner, you learn that every day I wake up and I wonder whether I'm going to screw it up or not. Literally every day. It doesn't matter if things are going really, really well. It doesn't matter if things are going really crappy. It's a fear that's always there, right? And so in a lot of ways, I think that can push you to work even harder towards things. Because then on some level too, once you accept that it's entirely within your control one way or the other, within reason, of course. Obviously, no one could have predicted a pandemic that closed everything. But you can always control how you're going to react and what you're going to do next, right? So there has to be a little bit of and it's funny because I'm like one of the most easygoing people. I'm not easily ruffled. I don't get super strung out. I don't get super worried about things. And part of the reason is just my experience over the past 8 years or so of running this business. When I started when I was 23, I didn't know anything. I had no idea what I was doing. I'm surprised I made it this far. Right. But I learned from those experiences that like stuff's going to happen. I'm not going to know what I'm doing. I'm going to have to figure it out as I go. Right. It's like that entrepreneur analogy where entrepreneurship is jumping off of a cliff and building the plane on the way down. Right. Like once you accept that that's just how it is. I think there's an opportunity to let go of all of the things, right? Because at the end of the day, I know I'm going to do my hardest to control the things I have direct control over to push me forward. And the things that are outside of my control are going to have their effect, whatever that may be. And if I'm going to worry about that, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because I can't do anything to change it anyways. Right? So I guess to answer your question, all the time do I have experiences where I feel like things are going wrong? And also not very often. It's kind of this melding of both.
That's deep. I mean, you always have me with your dramatic pauses because I'm like, oh, is there more? And it's like, there is more. But to kind of like bring us back a bit, like we talked about what we were going to chat about on this episode. We talked about like, okay, don't tell me what you've been up to as of late because it's like so many people's lives have been kind of on pause. But I mean, a few things that I can kind of like talk about here are the fact that like 2020 was the year when I really realized like how much people with like common energy, like common values, that's the word I was going for, how much they can gravitate towards each other and support one another regardless of geography, regardless of like whether you actually like physically have ever spent that much time with the person. Like with the amount of video calls that we had in the past 12 months and like the amount of just like bro afternoons, like it was just cool to realize like how much people need to like lean on one another, and how much we can benefit from leaning on one another. So I'm going to get to the point here, but the point is that you did something super cool and it involved dog sledding. I want to hear about like what was the thought process that led up to that? Like what made you think that's what you wanted to do? What did it feel like to finally do it? And what's your closing notes as far as having experienced it, having done it? What would you say to somebody else? Like give me the full scoop, the entire journey here.
It's something told me you were going to bring that up. So at the obviously with everything 2020 brought, let me back up a little bit. I have a bucket list, as I encourage everyone to have things I want to do before I punch my ticket on this earth, right? Now, a lot of people think of bucket lists as being certain things, right? Very grandiose, very big, out of this world stuff. And to some degree, those should absolutely be on your bucket list. But I also have things that are just things, small things that I've never done that I would like to be able to do. A good example is fly a kite. I've never flown a kite in my life. Don't judge me, Chris.
I'm judging
But
right now.
so I have things like that on there as well. I have places I want to see. I have things I want to do, big, small, everything in between. And my goal over the past couple of years was each year I want to try to cross some things off of this list. I add things as I go, as I discover new things, but I also want to start now crossing things off. So running with the Bulls in 2018 was one of them. To give you a sense of the obscurity of some of my bucket list items, one of them was not just to go to Italy, but to have a home-cooked Italian meal in the countryside of Italy. And so we did that. We took a cooking class in these two gentlemen's home in Tuscany, Italy, where we cooked homemade pasta with them. We ate it with them on their terrace overlooking the hillside and it was fantastic. Best meal we had while we were there, hands down. So going into 2021, I knew that 20, I don't think I crossed anything off of 2020 naturally, but 2021, I was like, all right, I need to get back to crossing things off this list. What am I going to do? International travel is kind of out of the question because we don't really know what's going on with that. We're still really not able to travel very many places, nor is it probably the best idea to. So what are some things I could do a little bit more locally? And so dog sledding was one of the things on my list. It's kind of different. It's adventurous. I wanted to do it. And when most people think dog sledding, they think a couple of things. They think Alaska. They think Canada. That's kind of it, right? Now, to go to Alaska or Canada, that's a pretty big trek. That's a trip, right? With a lot of logistics, a much longer trip than otherwise. But I was kind of thinking to myself, I'm like, this was probably in December, and so December in Michigan is cold and it's snowy. And I was like, what about Michigan? Like, we have snow, we have dogs. I'm sure somebody's dog sledding, right? So I Googled it and I found there's like half a dozen places that do dog sledding excursions in Michigan. So I booked, coincidentally on Valentine's Day, my girlfriend and I, we went up to the UP, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where there was a place that ran dog sled tours. And it was perfect because it was a short trip. We drove up on the afternoon on a Saturday. We spent the night. We had the first excursion, a 10-mile trek on the dog sled, which took us 2.5 hours because these dogs will run. And we were done by 11:30, 5-hour drive back home. We were back Sunday evening. right? So my girlfriend didn't have to take any vacation time. It was easy for me to fit it in my schedule. It was just one night and done. And it was a phenomenal. It was far cooler than I thought it was going to be. Literally and figuratively, because I actually booked it on the coldest day of the year. The high was 7 degrees Fahrenheit that day that we did this tour. But it was just like the coolest thing ever. Just to see the athletic prowess of these dogs, their ability to just run, and their ability, like, they're just incredible animals, well trained, very athletic. And the thing that probably surprised me the most was how peaceful it was, because it was silent, and you're just cruising through the woods. The only thing you hear is the buckles on the dog's collars, and you're just cruising. So definitely recommend it to anyone. If you live anywhere that's got snow at any point in time of the year, I bet you there's dog sledding somewhere close within reasonable distance. So you could look it up. I'm sure they do excursions. Definitely do it.
I mean, most of this show's audience should be good to go. Like,
that's a good point.
I mean, I've got listeners from all over the place, but last time I checked, there's a lot of listeners from Alberta. Canmore does dog sleigh rides and stuff like that. Like, the only thing that makes me wonder more about the whole thing is, like, I wonder, like, how much balance those dogs have. Like, are those dogs pretty burnt out? But, like, I won't dive too much into that rabbit hole. It's just like, it's something that popped into my head, but I'm just gonna brush past it right away here.
Well, I'm going to address that, because
Okay.
I think it's a lot of people that I tell this story to, that's their first question is, but, like, how are the dogs? You know? So obviously I can only give my own experience at one of these places, but a couple of things to keep in mind. One, the dogs are very well taken care of, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the dogs themselves, right? Because one thing in particular is the dogs sleep outside. Now, when it's really, really cold, that seems really mean, because you're like, they gotta be cold.
There's a lot of dogs that just function better outside than they do inside. Like, they overheat inside, like breed specific dogs.
And so dog sledding dogs, mainly Siberian and Alaskan Huskies and Malamutes, their coats are designed so they can withstand temperatures of negative 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So when it's 7 degrees Fahrenheit, they're comfortable. They're not cold, right? And oftentimes, you see, if you go on TikTok or Instagram Reels or whatever, you'll often see funny videos of people who own Huskies, and when it snows, they will not come inside. They're like, nah, I'm good. I want to be out in the snow, right? The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that the dogs are athletes, right? I remember our guide was telling us this when he was teaching me how to drive the sleigh. He said, listen, because the only thing you have to do to control the speed is put your foot on the brake. Because he said these dogs have one speed, as fast as they can forward, right? And so it's interesting because and this is true of anyone who's owned a Husky in their home. If you don't give them enough activity, they will go crazy. They will tear up your house because they need to get that energy out, right? And so the way I think about it is like me. If someone tried to prevent me from working out on a day, like, I would lose my mind. I'd be like, no, let me go. Like, I want to do it, So in that regard, it doesn't seem to me like they're being like forced to do it. Like, they want to do it. This is what they do. The other thing that's important that settled with me very well is how a sled dog retires. Are you familiar with how a sled dog retires?
My experience with it might be different than yours, so let's hear what you know about the whole experience.
So in my experience, and from what they were telling us, which I guess as a consumer of their product, it could be a little misleading, but basically 2 ways that a dog retires. One is if they get injured, if they can't run anymore, or if they have some medical condition that prevents them from being able to run or do that level of activity. And it's I believe that the life of a sled dog, in terms of their like competing and running, not their actual life, is about 8 or 9 years. A dog runs, and then it's got an additional 7 years or so of life where they're retired. Or so they either have an injury or a medical condition, or they just kind of wake up one day and they decide, I'm good. I don't want to run anymore. right? And you could tell because they get a very like, I don't want to be chained up. I don't want to run. They'll kind of slack a little bit. They're like, no, I'm good, right? Um, so that again, your experience may differ, and I'm kind of curious to hear how it does. Um, at least for me, was settling. Like, okay, they can like have some say in what's going on, right? They're not just being run to the bones.
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually went to Alaska as a little kid, and so we got to kind of see some of the dog sledding places, and we didn't, I think we might have tried it out. I can't even remember all the things we did and what we just kind of like checked out, but it was definitely fun. Like I recommend the experience. And in that instance, it was just like kind of a ragtag group of dogs that just they brought out all these dogs together. They could work together pulling the dog sleigh, and it worked out quite well. And so it's kind of like you're just giving them something to do. They're doing it. They're having fun, putting in a workout. So it completely lines up with your experiences there. And then I've seen a few of the dog sledding companies or whatever that go through Camrose or not Camrose, Canmore, not Camrose, Canmore, Alberta, and it was just cool to see just how fast they are and how athletic they are. So I can see that it's kind of like it's very similar to how when people aren't able to access the gym, like what happens to them. So if it's like if this dog is used to like putting in like a solid workout and then all of a sudden they can't, I could see how that would impact things. And then just like yeah, like when somebody is operating a business where like they're taking the best care of these dogs and they're giving them the best food and they're giving them this solid structure and routine to help with their health, like everything, like all businesses, there's going to be ones where it's like okay, they're just like burning out these creatures, just kind of like running them to their wits end. Maybe not the best conditions, maybe not the best food, all these other things. Like there's always going to be a full spectrum, but in the instances where it is just like yeah, we are all enjoying the experience. We're all putting in the work. This specific breed of dog is like ideal for these conditions. And when it does not want to do this in the morning, we listen and we kind of let it live out its years in ways that suit what that dog actually wants to do. Like it's like not like they're being forced into it. We ended up going off on quite the tangent, but
Well, I'll say one other thing about it because I think this is important to recognize too, and it's something that oddly like I didn't even think about until I was like with these dogs. Is if you think about all the different breeds of dogs that there are, which all of them are human intervention to create, right? Some of them worse off than others. Like if you think of a bulldog who we've literally smushed their face in so much that they can't breathe well, just because we wanted them to do a job or have an aesthetic. And then you look at Malamute Huskies, which are literally, of all dog breeds, the least human intervened breeds, right? They're the closest to their original wolf ancestors. To me, the fact that they've been the least changed, obviously they've been domesticated, so they're not, dangerous or whatever. And in some ways they've been bred to want to run more and to be more active and to, have more energy and be faster and things like that. But the fact that they are much less influenced by humans is, I think, something that's pretty important too. Right?
yeah, that's a solid point too, and it's a cool point that you bring up, and just how dynamic the types of dogs that are out there are. Like just how some people will pick a dog for an appearance, and then you think about it, and it's like, oh, wow, like it took like generations of selection of dogs to come up with that dog with that appearance. It's relatable to the whole like area of wellness in the sense that sometimes we have to take a step back and think about okay, like how do our parents perform, what do our parents look like, what are our parents tendencies and strengths and weaknesses, because that's going to have some relation to us if it's coming down to genetics, as far as like what's going to come easily, what's going to be challenging, what we're probably going to look like. Like there's a running joke within the industry that like if you hang around basketball players as a short person, you're not going to be all of a sudden a tall basketball player, regardless how you're trying to surround yourself with like people of a certain ability, and so it transfers over to like strength capacity and just our body's response to different elements and food sources and stuff. Like, I don't go too far into the weeds with things as far as like nutrition in the sense that if you are having vegetables and an abundance of protein sources and staying hydrated, you're going to be in the clear. Now, some people aren't going to be able to have certain vegetables. Some people aren't going to be able to have certain protein sources, and some people's sources of hydration are going to be different based on like preference and stuff like that. Like some people are going to like cold water, some people are going to like warm water, and that's just the way she goes. But at the end of it all, like you can't expect yourself to look like completely different from your parents or your siblings. There's going to be some resemblance, and your lifestyle choices can definitely kind of like pave the path for the outcome that you have. But I'm never going to be like super tall like LeBron or super speedy like an Olympian. Like I'm going to be like somewhere in the middle because like my parents weren't professional athletes, but there's going to be things that I am good at because like in general population there's things that like my parents just like anybody else's parents were kind of one of the better ones in their room at. And it's an interesting anecdote, and it's another rabbit hole that we went on. I'm going to get us back like dialed in back on track here. So having gone on that little adventure of yours, that was one of your bucket list things. What are two bucket list things that are on your mind at this moment, at this very moment, and you're like, okay, these are the two things that stood out, and why do they stand out to you?
That is a good question. What are two things that stand out to me in this moment? I guess probably one of them is because in thinking about what my next international trip was going to be, there's a hike in Norway. So my family's Norwegian. There's a hike in Norway. I say that, but I've literally never been there, nor has anyone in my immediate family. But that's neither here nor there. Definitely not there. In Norway, there's a hike that leads to this cliff overlook called Pulpit Rock, is what it's famously known as. That has this tremendous view of like the valley and the mountain range and this giant river that just runs through it. And it literally looks like the best example I can give is like Pride Rock from The Lion King. It literally looks like that. And of course it's Europe. So there's no safety nets. There's nothing like around the edges of this thing. It's literally just a rock cliff, go at your own risk kind of thing. And so that is one of the top items on my bucket list, and potentially one of my next international trip to do that. Why that's on my mind? Probably just because obviously being cooped up for the past year, like I want to be able to travel like that again, and especially the overwhelmingly wonderful experiences I've had in all facets on my last two international trips to Spain and Italy. I just want that again. I want that culture shock. I want that sense of adventure and exploration. So that's definitely one of the ones on the top of my mind. And then probably the other one is flying a kite because we just talked about it. But also it's one that I could easily just go to the supermarket and spend $30 to get a kite and do it like tomorrow if I wanted to.
Like what happened to you that you never flew a kite? Like what made you so busy that flying a kite didn't come up, or what was missing? What was the missing ingredient?
It never interested me as a kid, to be honest. I mean, I've never been excited. I played sports as a kid, but I was never excited about it. Even to this day, I hate watching sports on television. My girlfriend makes fun of me because she comes from a big football family, so they're big into it. And I'm just like, I don't want to spend 3 hours of my weekend watching people play a sport. I'd rather go outside and play the sport than watch other people play the sport, kind of thing. Even though I can understand before people give me stuff about it, the beauty in watching professionals do it at such a high level, like I can appreciate that. The same way that I can think it's amazing to watch someone break a deadlift world record, right? I still don't want to sit around and watch them for 3 hours, but I get it. But I was never into sports, so I was never like outside doing that. I was really inactive as a kid. This was kind of like the booming age of video games too, so that kind of sucked me in, and so it was just never like it was never a thing. I don't know. I don't think either of my brothers have flown a kite either, to be honest with you.
Well, I guess to give you some perspective or just at least share my story, I mean, when I was a kid growing up in the country, like sometimes there's like nothing to do. And it it kind of relates to the idea of like not worrying so much about what you're dealt and worrying more about how you respond to it. Like windy day, can't really go for a bike ride, can't do all kinds of things. Things are blowing all over the yard, but you can take like a piece of like really cheap fabric and some sticks and a piece of string and you can watch that thing fly like crazy. And then it's just like it was always cool because every time we would fly a kite, like my parents would get these kite kits and oftentimes we'd end up having to go through and get a new kite. Like we'd have a kite that would last like maybe like 5 or 6 attempts and then we'd have to upgrade our kite because like I mean there's going to be some obvious wind damage, you might lose it, get stuck to a tree, all kinds of other things. But just how simple it was to kind of like start that process and follow through with it amidst it being an otherwise like bad day, like how things wouldn't have necessarily been ideal for so many other things, but we looked at our situation, looked at our environment and found a way to capitalize on it. So that's like a cool analogy for people who might be in doom and gloom right now in like the beginning of 2021, expecting to be able to travel, expecting to cross things off their bucket list and not being able to. When it's windy, you can fly a kite. When the economy isn't going your way, you can find the industries to which the economy is going that way. There's always opportunity. You just have to be looking for it. To kind of get us onto our path that we are traveling here on this show, there, since your last appearance on the Lifestyle Chase, I have been having my guest give the audience a challenge for the day. Now, you might be familiar with this. You might have been prepared, but you might not be. And for that reason, I am rambling a little bit to give you some time to think in your head of what challenge you would give my audience that is unique to you, but is not so much that they'll forget what you said, just finite and concise enough that it might change how their week goes. It might completely change the outcome of the month of March for the listeners. So whenever you're ready, you're going to say your challenge for the day is, and then you're just going to give it to them.
Oh, well, I got to jump right. Can I give some context afterwards?
Oh, yes. Yes, you can.
There's going to be an explanation. So my challenge for listeners today is to open up a piece of paper, journal, notepad on their phone, Word doc on their computer, whatever they need. And they're going to write down 3 things that they did really, really well today or this past week. Could be anything. Could be they did the dishes really well. Like those plates sparkled like they've never sparkled before. 3 things they did really, really well. And here's why. This all boils back to mindset, right? Because I think our mindset, first and foremost, is the lens that we put on to view the rest of the world. When we have it's basically the narrative, the stories we write for ourselves in our head about the stimulus we're experiencing, the sights, the sounds, the feelings, the emotions, the media, whatever it is. We experience that stimulus, and then we have to give it a story to give it meaning. So our mindset is essentially the flavor of the meaning that we give it. Negative mindsets, with that lens, we're more likely to see all of the negative happening in our lives. Or, more importantly, we're more likely to interpret the activities in our lives as being negative. This is true if there was an inconvenience at the grocery store, that person did it on purpose. It could be as far-fetched as someone giving us a compliment and us not really believing it because of that negative mindset. In turn, having a positive lens and a positive mindset allows us to write different narratives. We can see the positive in these exchanges, whether it's the inconvenience at the grocery store or the compliment that we get. The interesting thing is once we start to recognize the positive, and we start to write those positive stories, we start to see more positive in our daily life. in all areas. And so this activity, this challenge that I'm giving you to write down 3 things you've done well is the first step to start if we're suffering from a negative mindset, or if we could even just have a better, more positive mindset. It's going to start the process of taking off those negative glasses and putting on the positive ones. Because with that positive mindset, everything has a different tint to it, different shade. A little bit more color.
I like that. Like, I mean, that's actually something people could do. Like, they could put that into action. And if they're having trouble thinking about, like, what are the 3 positive things, don't overthink it. Like, keep it simple. Honestly, like, there's so many good things that can happen. Like, for me, often what I reflect on is the fact that we had so much time to kind of like build each other up in our own respective careers and support one another as friends. And I think that's super awesome. And like, no matter what happens in our respective careers, like no matter what obstacles we have to overcome, we have that solid foundation. And so I would recommend other people find that within their careers, within their journeys. Like if you're trying to make changes in your life and your fitness or your nutrition, you got to be surrounded by some semblance of like a support system, like something where people got your back and you know it, and you know it through the actions that they take and the things that you can be grateful for. We got another question for you. Are you ready? This one, you'll be familiar with this one. This one is, if you could give one piece of advice to someone on how to live their life to the fullest, what would that piece of advice be?
Ooh, that's a good question. That is a good question. I am going to say my piece of advice is to embark on the journey to be able to believe in yourself again. Because this creates the most fundamental idea behind what I try to instill in other people. The thing that's most likely to lead to success in fitness, in our careers, in our personal lives, whatever it is a fundamental belief in ourselves that we are capable of that. A lot of people, too many people, have let that belief go or have been wrongly convinced that they're not capable.
That's deep. Well, it's so true. And something that I thought about recently was how if you're surrounded by the right people, those people will probably believe in you more than you believe in yourself some days. If the people around you believe in you less than you, maybe you need to reassess a few things. And it is like, absolutely, I hope people actually take your advice to heart. I think it's very helpful. My challenge for people listening to this, seeing as how this has been the first episode where we have live streamed the show, I do challenge people to go back and listen to episode 77, where we first had our interview together. It was like probably the first time we have spoken at great length. Since then, we've guest starred on several episodes of Cool, Calm, and Chaotic with our friend Mark Zaret, who you introduced me to, and it became one of the biggest bromances of this century. So with all of that being said, I'd like to thank you so much for coming back on the show, for spending time with me today. How can the people find more about you? Where do you want them to go? We always link your social media, but where else can they find you?
Absolutely. Well, you can always, of course, like you said, find me on Instagram and Facebook, but you can also read some of my articles. You can read more about me. I've got some free courses and some other free resources you can get at my website, which is ateamfit.com, ateamfit.com, for all the good stuffs.
And the beautiful thing is, if they Google your name, like if they just literally Google Alex McBrairty, they're going to find a lot of good stuff, which is handy. You did a good job of that. I know it's those things don't happen by accident. So again, thanks for joining me, and that wraps up this episode.
I appreciate you, Chris. Thanks for having me.